Hello, everyone, and we welcome you all to the second session in ASI's 45 Minutes On series, and today's session being on the ASI Oversight Assessment Process. We'd like to spend between 25 and 30 minutes on what it is, what it's not, what do we look for, and why is it needed, as well as go through some of the improvements we've seen over the last 6 to 12 months from the auditors, and some improvements we'd like to see more of. My name's Cameron Jones. I'm the Director of Assurance with ASI. And before we provide a brief introduction for both Natalie and myself, I'd like to draw your attention to the Code of Conduct and the Acknowledgement of Indigenous Persons, which you can see available on our website. A quick overview of myself. As I said, my name is Cameron Jones, and I've been with ASI for about the last 15 months. And prior to my role with ASI, I've worked in a number of roles within industry, with some of the large multinational companies, and also with some of the international consultancy associations as well as running my own business as an environmental consultant. And believe it or not, in a past life of mine too, I myself was an auditor as well too. So I understand and appreciate the auditor side of things as well. So look, now I'm going to pass you over to Natalie, who's going to provide you with a quick overview of herself also.
Hello to you all, and thank you for joining us today. My name's Natalie Sharp, and I'll be a new face to many of you after having commenced at ASI at the start of this year as the Certifications Manager. I'm based in Melbourne in Australia and have an environmental science background, and for a significant part of my working life, I've been managing the rollout of voluntary industry-run certification programs in the automotive industry and in the urban development and building industry. So I'm pleased to be here to run through the process that we undertake during oversight, and for you all to be able to put a face to a name at the bottom of that email. Hopefully that email is one of those lovely congratulation emails. But before we move on to today's session, and what Cam and I wish to discuss with you includes what oversight is and also what oversight is not. We'll look to provide a general overview of the ASI procedure for oversight, and we'll also take you through our step-by-step approach for undertaking oversight. We'll also look at some of the problems that we do often encounter, and as well as the improvements that we have seen recently. And then we will open up to a Q&A session. So we want that Q&A session to be as interactive as possible. So we're really wanting to hear those questions and comments from you all. So to do this, you'll see a Q&A function button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you could please type your questions in here. And as Cam and I go through our presentation, where possible, we'll weave answers for those questions into our responses. Otherwise, at the end of the session, when we get to our Q&A, we'll be able to answer those at that time as well. So let's look at what oversight actually is. And fundamentally, oversight is that review process that we undertake before issuing certification to the performance standard or the chain of custody standard. It provides that confirmation that is necessary to show that the audit firm has conducted the audit in accordance with the requirements of ASI's assurance manual, which covers those processes for achieving certification and the general principles for conducting an effective audit. It also provides a double check or a fresh set of eyes, if you like, which allows us to check that all the relevant fields have been completed correctly, and it provides an opportunity for a check on the scope, the supply chain issue that, can't get my words out today, the supply chain activities, the language, and the hyperlinks. But a key aspect of all of this is maintaining a focus on what the more material or the more significant issues for that audit and for that entity are. So I'll send over to you, Cam, to briefly explain what oversight is not.
Yeah, look, thanks, Natalie. So look, it's not a lot of things as well too. We're not out to re-audit the audit. That's your job as auditors, is to do the audit. We're not re-auditing the audit. We're also not out necessarily to reassess your conformance ratings. We certainly want to test and probe and consider those conformance ratings, and we'll certainly ask questions if we've got some concerns or worries about the ratings, but we're not out to redo those conformance ratings. We take what you've done first as auditors, and then As required, we may apply a level of devil's advocacy where needed, but we're not reinterpreting every single finding. And we're also not wanting to write the audit. That's your job in the public headline statements. Sure, we might do a little bit of massaging and work a little bit around grammar and punctuation and maybe get the odd statement to read a little bit nicer. But generally speaking, you as the auditors are preparing the report. So our oversight procedure states that the ASI Secretariat is to confirm that the ASI accredited auditing firm has conducted and documented ASI audits consistent with the requirements of the ASI Assurance Manual. And Natalie just touched on that a few minutes earlier. Enhance the competence and consistency of assurance providers, the audit firms and auditors, through direct feedback. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later in terms of the feedback we provide and so forth. And also identify any ongoing improvement opportunities in ASI's assurance system. And look, there might be an opportunity for participants today to raise any potential opportunities for improvement as well in the Q&A, but we'll get to that a little bit later. Look, and going through this process many, many times each year, and look, last year I think we had nearly 80. I think it was 77 audits, surveillance, scope change, and first-time audits. We've identified a number of common issues and areas for improvement, and we'll get to those in the second half of this presentation today. But first, we wanted to run through the process with you all. It's a step-by-step process that Natalie and I use through Elemental, just in the same way as you, as auditors and as members, enter your information into Elemental as well. So Natalie's going to start off this by going through the first few steps of our oversight process.
Thanks, Cam. So I will run through those first few steps which relate to reviewing the audit team, the audit scope, and generally speaking, how was the audit conducted, including whether there were any red flags for us in terms of the audit. So these steps require us as the oversight assessor to assess the lead auditor or the audit lead or the audit team leader. The sorts of questions that we ask ourselves during this is the lead auditor appropriately qualified, and do they have the required scope both in country of the audit and the supply chain activities? This information sits at the back end of Elemental, and we'll access that information as we require it. So we'll also look for operations with specific significant issues. So let's take an example of a bauxite mine with issues such as biodiversity, rehabilitation, and local communities as one example. So the question here is, does the lead auditor have the necessary experience to respond to an audit in that respect? So if the lead auditor doesn't have that experience, does anyone else in the audit team have that experience, and can it be picked up elsewhere? So when we look if there are any potential conflicts with the audit team in terms of the work that they may have done with the audited entity, now auditors are usually really good in disclosing any conflicts or any potential conflicts well before the audit. So typically not an issue, but we still do check on that one. Then that next step comes the formalities around the audit scope. So we'll be looking at consistency between the planned and the actual scope. Is it commensurate with the entity's aspects, their impacts, their area of influence? And then we get to the audit schedule and the plan. There are appropriate audit hours. Is there coverage of the criteria? Are there management and employee interviews incorporated into that, and appropriate time established for that? And then the supply chain activities and other details such as location, facility names, the audit dates, the key contacts, and on we go from there. So we also look at whether there's any exclusions, and if any of those exclusions haven't been clearly explained or provided, information provided, we'll ask that question of why. And then before we move to the next step, we consider that catch-all question of whether there were any issues identified during the audit. Those issues may include the cooperation of the member, if there are any disagreements, or were there any other limitations. Again, these are rare, but we still need to check on this. And I'll head over to Cam to run through the actual audit component and for what we look for in those next few steps.
Yeah, thanks, Nat. Look, after we've gone through the formalities that Natalie's just run through with you all, The next thing we need to do is to look at the level, the detail, and the completeness of the objective evidence provided. I mean, this is really the crux of the audit. It's what you as auditors find on site. It's that objective evidence provided and presented in Elemental for us to look through. So we like to see the names of procedures and documents, dates, who you spoke to, what criteria, and the title, who you've spoken to for what specific criteria. We also like to see in much more detail in the observations section. And this is important too, to delineate the difference between providing more detail in the observation sections of Elemental versus the public headline statement. So we'd like to see a lot more of the detail in the observations, and the public headline statement is what the public read. Hey, surprise, surprise, the public headline statement is for the public. And we'll get to the public headline statements a little later. Look, this has happened, but not that it's happened yet, but we do keep an eye out for critical breaches. But invariably, if a critical breach were to occur, we would be expecting the auditor to be sending us an email, or better still, hop on the telephone straight away and let us know. But if we do come across this, we'd down our tools immediately, so to speak, hop on the phone to the auditor, have that discussion. And also, as I said, look, hoping that that would be identified before even the audit has been completed. But we haven't seen a case like this first, but we still keep this in the back of our minds. Look, the next step when reviewing the evidence and the findings are both obviously the major non-conformances, if there are any, and the minor non-conformances. And the key for us is that they have been appropriately assessed. Major non-conformances in particular are important in that this means full certification is not achievable. So we certainly focus on these to make sure they have been appropriately assessed. And we're looking, in this instances, we're looking for absence in policies, systems, procedures, but also a lack of implementation as well. And we've come across several major non-conformances over the last year or two where the processes essentially are in place, but they're actually not being implemented. So a member or an entity may have developed a procedure, they may have developed a plan or a policy, that's great, but it's actually not being used and it's not being implemented. So therefore, we've seen some major non-conformances. And in the oversight assessment process, we will test that. We also look not only at development, but also implementation. One thing that we do spend a bit of time on are the not applicables. And actually today, Natalie and I have had a good discussion over the phone with respect to a couple of not applicables that have come up in a recent audit that we're going through at the moment. And look, sure, Elemental does auto-generate not applicables based on those supply chain activities for the entity. But what about those not applicables that the auditor has determined to be specifically not applicable to that entity? So all we can say is that we prefer a detailed discussion in the observation section of the audit report where possible, explaining why that's not applicable. I think that's a really important point. So explaining to us and also to the member why that's not applicable, not just saying, look, it's not applicable. So for all the major non-conformances, we're also on the lookout for corrective actions, as well as those previous major non-conformances, wanting to see evidence of corrective actions and have they been and how have they been implemented. So after looking at the conformance ratings, we then check to make sure the auditor declaration and the audit outcome are completed. And this is essentially the auditor or the audit team signing off on the audit report. And would you believe it? Yes, sometimes this is actually blank. So it's amazing that this is the sign-off mechanism for the auditor for the audit report, and sometimes this is left blank. So it gets Natalie and I a little bit frustrated, but credit to you all, that has been improving over the last few months. So look, I'll stop talking for the moment and hand back over to Natalie, and she's going to discuss the public headline statement component of our assessment, which invariably is our most labour-intensive component during our oversight. Thanks, Nat.
Thanks, Cam. And after we've gone through the above, we then focus on those public headline statements. And look, I agree with you there, Cam. This component is the most labour-intensive aspect of our oversights. So as these assessments are the link between the audit and the public, we really want to see that those public headline statements are written clearly and succinctly. I think the key takeaway here is that the public headline statements should be different from the observations. You know, they should provide a summary of no more than 2 or 3 sentences on why the rating was provided. And part of that, it's critical to ensure the use of English is as best as it can be. Part of that time-consuming component here is that we are often having to edit the language, the spelling, the grammar, the capitalisation, to ensure that there's consistency across the report. So it's important to remember and to remind everyone that in making these adjustments to the public headline statements, we do not change the intent of the statement. The only exception to that might be if there's a major error, such as a copying error or a transcription error, we'll make that adjustment. But as part of reviewing the public headline statements, we also check that the hyperlinks included are working correctly, and then secondly, that are they taking the reader to the correct place as well. So next step is really what some of the problems that we're experiencing along the way. They can be varied, but we do see sort of some common themes coming through as well. So some of the common problems that we've been experiencing lately are looking at that mismatch between the facility name and the name which is listed as the business or facility or program and product in the audit scope. So as long as we've got a better match between those fields having the correct name, that reduces the likelihood of us needing to get back to you and get some adjustments going on there. The exclusion of head office activities from the scope, where there's only a small number of interviews for head office staff, or there's a limited management activity or control from head office for performance standard audit, for example. Typically, the head office isn't going to be included as an audited business or facility, but wording to the effect of those activities or the departments that have been involved from head office should be included in that audit scope and the certification scope. Another one is looking at the member name and the entity name and making sure that those what's entered into those fields is consistent with our formal systems. So the name on the certificate will be one of those two, the entity name or the member name. However, it's more commonly being used for the certification name to include the entity name, as it could be a little bit more descriptive for stakeholders there. Another problem that we're finding, the details of the evidence being observed is not being listed in the objective evidence column. So often when we're reading through, we might see titles of documents, but what we're looking for is a little bit more information outlined within the evidence column as to how that was relevant. And then public headline statements. We do see quite a few issues around the public headline statements. They're not included, not written as complete sentences. Often we'll see a list from what was the evidence cited included as the public headline statement. And as Cam had mentioned before, this really is that bridge between the audit and what the public is seeing. So if we're able to see some complete sentences there. A rewrite of the criterion rather than using evidence to demonstrate conformance. So we're really looking to ensure that those public headline statements are a summary of the evidence and the findings and what was demonstrated during that process, rather than a rewrite of the criterion or the requirement. We're also seeing no reasoning being provided for a finding of non-conformance. It'd be great to identify upfront that when there is a non-conformance, and instead of including a statement of what the entity has evidence towards meeting that requirement, if they're able to also demonstrate the however, this is the part that wasn't in conformance. We also see some inclusion of names of individuals in those public headline statements, which we remove. We exclude them to protect the identity of the individual, and we do that under those privacy laws. So instead, if we can include a role or a position name rather than an individual's name in there. We also see the use of acronyms and abbreviations in the public headline statement. So please just define those that are used when they appear for the first time in the public headline statement. Those acronyms which are used within the standards, so greenhouse gas might be a GHG, that's fine to include it in that because it's already identified elsewhere. But for new terms, if we could use that as an extension rather than abbreviation. And hyperlinks not working. Look, we might see that there's links are blocked by a firewall. If that's the case, an alternative access or an alternative link should be made available. We also see hyperlinks potentially directing readers to a home page. On occasion, those links are to a landing page rather than specifically to a report or a document which is being addressed. So doing that creates a little bit of a time-consuming activity for the reader if they're needing to go through and scroll down to find the information and then click on that link. So it's also important with hyperlinks as well to include that page or a section number, particularly when it's a large document. So we'll see sustainability reports which might be 60, 80, even 100 pages. So including a page or a section number so that the reader can go directly to the section that's relevant to them is really very helpful. So Cam, if you'd just like to wrap up and before we allow to ask some of those questions, just by highlighting some of the improvements that we've seen over the last 6 months.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. And look, Natalie's been whacking you over the head for the last 5 minutes, telling you what, some of the things that we need to see improvements from. But look, hey, I'll play good cop here and say that, look, thank you to all of you for a real improvement. We've noticed a real improvement in audit reports over the last 6 to 9 months on a number of fronts. So I just wanted to go through those a little bit for you over the last, what we've seen over the last 6 to 9 months. So, as we know, the world was shook like nothing else about March last year, and that was in the form of COVID-19. So we had to think on our feet and be quite proactive in terms of how we're going to keep our certification program going, primarily through the use of remote auditing techniques wherever possible. So we developed our interim policy on that, and credit to both members and auditors for backing us on that one and making it work really well too. So the acceptance and use of COVID-19 related finding of unable to rate, which was a functionality we added to Elemental a little bit later on in the process. Both members and auditors accepting that option of unable to rate through a remote audit has been excellent. So the uptake has been really good, and we'd like to see that continue as long as we need to, as long as we're in this COVID situation where travel restrictions still remain. Hopefully not too much longer, but we'll need to bide our time there. Look, initially we were seeing conformances and not applicables given, but with an improved understanding of our interim policy and recognition that a finding of unable to rate actually strengthens the transparency of the audit. It doesn't undermine it in any way. And it's actually led to a greater adoption of this unable to rate in audits that are undertaken remotely. Look, secondly, and I mentioned earlier, the audit outcomes and audit declarations, some of them have been left blank or they've been selected no instead of yes. Look, that had been quite problematic and taking up a fair bit of Natalie and my time, and also Caroline as well too. But these fields are being commonly completed now. We haven't seen a lot of issues lately. So again, thank you. We're also noticing an improved presentation of certification scopes, the inclusion of headquarters in the written scope up front to remove that ambiguity that some stakeholders have sort of said, was headquarters involved? Was it not? What sort of level of HQ involvement was there? So that's being improved in that presentation of the certification and the audit scopes too. So great. Look, thanks again to you all on that one. So we're just going to pass back to my mate Natalie, and she's going to wrap things up here.
Thanks, Cam. Well, that is it from us. So we'd like to open up to any questions that you do have. And also in our quest for continual improvement, if you have any suggestions for modifications or improvements, please let us know. And as always, if you're not comfortable in a setting like this to do so, please just feel free to email Cam or myself anytime. So again, thank you all. We'll open up to any questions or comments that you do have. And while you're busy typing those into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, Cam and I will address those few questions that we received in the lead up to today's session. And we'll take the opportunity now to also read through those questions that have been popped into Q&A box while we've been doing our presentation. So it might get a little bit messy here as we do this, but one of the earlier questions, and I'll have the floor, I've got the floor here, Cam, so I'll ask you this first question and I'll let you jump in to answer. So one of the earlier questions we received were, the standards can be ambiguous in what has to be documented as a must-do for small to medium enterprises. So how do the standards and the oversight process make allowances for us SMEs?
Okay, well, pretty topical actually, and I'll get to the reason why it's a little bit topical in a minute. But look, the guidance document provides the explanation behind each criterion, and that can be used to help members and also auditors understand the context of that requirement of the criterion. So it's important to use the guidance for both standards and not rely on a specific individual or literal interpretation of the criteria. Of course, we're here to help, and Natalie and I invariably, and others of the Secretariat, are often on the phone or email to members and auditors, providing some specific guidance as required. If a specific question about a criteria, I often get emails, and Natalie does too. I'm in the middle of an audit, we've come across criterion, here's the position, here's what the guidance says, what do you think? So we can also provide a little bit of guidance on that way as well too. Look, another way to check into is to tap into the transparency of ASI's approach as well and identify similar organisations as your own in terms of size and activities. Have a look at their public audit reports as well too. Review their audit reports and the criterion in particular which may be of concern. And these reports are all available on ASI's website. And what I just said earlier with respect to this question being a little bit topical, looking to the future and the revision of our current standards, and we've had this recent discussion just last week about planning to establish a new working group specific for SMEs and SME concerns and interpretation and applicability of both standards to help these smaller organisations with more clarity on what's expected of them to be able to demonstrate conformance and what specifically are the minimum requirements an SME needs to implement to ensure conformance to the standard. So look, another one's popped through. So I'm going to read this one out, and then actually I'm going to hand it over to Nat to respond to this one. Okay. During an oversight assessment for our client, there was the suggestion we might want to consider increasing the number of surveillance audits from 1 to 2. Is this normal, Natalie?
I wouldn't say it's a regular situation to occur. So no, I don't think it is normal. But it may be, suggested in a situation where completeness of the audit report might be lacking in combination with some other problems that are evident as well. So it might be that combination of, say, the evidence and the observations being very limited in detail, plus perhaps too great a reliance on just having testimonial evidence. Then all of this in combination could give ASI, cause to think that maybe the entity just wasn't completely ready for the audit, or maybe there's not the robustness in systems that is required for a less frequent surveillance audit program. Therefore, a suggested increase in the opportunities for the entity to check in on the systems might assist in that process of getting them ready and through the next stage. So I know in a recent audit where this has occurred, and if it's the same one, in the process of ASI sending those queries to the auditor, significantly more information and more detail was provided back. And that information was then incorporated into the audit report, which then meant that suggestion to reconsider the proposed surveillance audit program, it just wasn't necessary necessary anymore. So I think a question like this is a really good example of how auditors can streamline their client moving through an oversight smoothly and receiving that certification as soon as possible. So by providing that detail up front, including it in the evidence, popping it in the observation, and then ensuring that that public headline statement is an accurate but concise reflection of this, I think is a good way to move things through the process. Just looking there, we've got another question there. We've actually got a couple of questions to get through here, Cam. So I'll just ask that next one. And if you're unable to see after this, then I will, I'll head back to asking the question again. But here we go for this next one. There was mention earlier in the presentation about oversight not reassessing conformance ratings. But we've had a conformance finding questioned by the ASI assessor in the past. Over to you.
Yeah, no, look, good question. I don't want to contradict myself here in saying that, look, that is correct. Ideally, in a perfect world, we don't want to go about reassessing conformance ratings. But as I've actually mentioned up front, though, we do look at them. And it's important for everyone to understand that those findings may be consistent with the assurance manual and maybe will be highlighted by myself or Natalie. And the assigned reviewer and the request for information to support the finding will be asked. I think that's the important thing too. If there's not sufficient evidence provided in the audit report and there's a rating, particularly a major, we want to know more about that. So therefore, by default, we are questioning that rating because there's not enough evidence provided in the audit report to suggest it. As I said, particularly a major and to a certain extent minor. So if a rating's been given and it's a significant one, and there's not much suggesting as to why that is, we will certainly go back. So look, there's a couple of examples I can provide too. Look, the first one related to the publication of reports for performance standard certification. Conformance rating was given to a criterion related to a publication of a report, which, while finalised internally within the entity, actually hasn't been made public or made available to any stakeholders or on the website. So when a criterion specifically requires disclosure, we can't accept the conformance findings for the entity about to do it. So the audit is assessing performance at that time. The thing about we're going to do it, we're about to do it, doesn't cut it, unfortunately. So the cutoff is the audit date. So is the requirement met at the time of the audit? And in this case, it hadn't. So in a situation like this, we'd encourage the public headline statement to not just reflect that it's a non-conformance due to the report not being made public, but also provide detail as to where the process is at. So look, by all means include that the report's been signed off by the entity, but the publication's on hold so that it aligns with a media announcement on upcoming financial report, whatever it happens to be. So I know we like our public headline statements to be succinct, but you can provide that extra little bit of context in only a handful of words, and that makes it so much more clearer to us and to stakeholders and readers of the report too. Look, a second example as well, and this comes up from time to time, is about mergers and acquisitions and divestment and closures. And again, Natalie and I are on the phone today talking about one of these as well too, where a conformance finding has actually been given because there actually hasn't been any M&A activity or divestment activities. So the requirement here is not actually looking as to whether anything's happened, but it's to make sure that the processes are in place if something happens. So an auditor may be asked to reconsider from us whether the evidence demonstrates that a process is in place and then reassess the finding based on that. So look, and one last example too relates to the changing of findings around the COVID affected audits too, from a non-applicable to conformance, maybe to more accurately align with our policy, and then also an unable to rate as well too. So if you look at our interim policy, there's a number of criteria that are listed to say, look, hey, you haven't got out on the site. You really need to get on the site to speak to people, to look at certain aspects. So therefore, you really need to be putting in an unable to rate until such time that you're able to get back out onto site in 6 months' time. So another question that's coming in, Natalie, and you and I can have a crack at this. I'll start off. The question is, do hyperlinks always have to be available in English? The answer is preferable, but no, does not have to be, even though English is in working language. the wonders of things like Google Translate and so forth certainly help us there. And no, look, they don't have to be available in English. And certainly with our Chinese entities, invariably the hyperlinks take us straight to something written in Mandarin, which is fine. And we can, and invariably Natalie and I do check to make sure that hyperlink is taking us to the right spot too. So we'll do the old copy and paste, whack it into Google Translate and make sure it's available there. But look, anything further to add, Natalie, on that?
Not really, Cam. I think it's just important to make sure that that link is available. As you mentioned, preferably it's in English, but understand that not every document is going to be available in the English language. So that's it.
Yeah.
There are a couple more questions there. So if you're happy to move on, I've got one over in the chat function. So what are the latest updates on the standards revision and what preliminary changes can we expect next year?
Right, that's a small question with a huge answer, and it's one that I'm probably not prepared to provide at the moment. All I can provide you with respect to how standards is going is that through the 60-day consultation period, we received, I think, don't quote me on this, but nearly 620 comments, of which Krista West and most of the Secretariat have been working very hard, going through all those comments and so forth, and prioritising, looking for duplication, and looking at some of the quick wins, the low-hanging fruit that we can apply. But some of those bigger issues are being, how do I say, deviated or directed, is probably the better word, directed to the Standards Committee and the suite of working groups: greenhouse, human rights, recycling, biodiversity, chain of custody, etc. So there's a lot of discussion to go through, and there's also a second round of public consultation occurring later in the year as well, before we're in any position to actually say these are what the updates are going to be. There is a document on our website that actually gives you a heads up on what those changes are likely to be. Certainly not confirmed, but that is available in our standards sort of update bulletin that was released early April from memory, in terms of what the changes are at this stage, subject to discussion and approval by the various processes in-house. So that's a little bit of a waffling answer from me, but yeah, it's probably a little bit presumptuous for me to explain what those changes would be at this stage. Another question's come in. This is a logistical or a more of a technological question, but there are restrictions on file size to be uploaded. Is it convenient to zip a file for all evidence for an element and upload it as one file? But the size restriction makes it difficult to do so. Look, the response there too is what you can do to circumvent that. Obviously, we would like in the audit report, if there's specific documentation that you would like us as the oversight assessors to look at, if it's not attachable due to size or inconsistent or incompatible file type, let us know with a comment, and then you'd be able to send that through to us separately via email. Preferably, we'd like everything incorporated into your elemental report, so it's all there in one spot. But if there's a technological or an IT issue where those documents are either too big or they just don't attach, let us know what those documents are, and then you can still send them through to Natalie and I for us as part of the oversight assessment process. And look, that's happened a couple of times actually, where we've gone back and asked, look, we'd like to see this and this. The auditors come back and go, well, I couldn't attach it because it was too big. Here you go. Here's an email. Natalie and I have looked through it and gone, great, excellent. That's what we're after. Thank you very much. Good. Tick, we'll move on. So there are ways around that if the files are a little bit too big. So again, make a note in your report and then you can send it through to us separately.
I might just jump in now, Cam.
Yeah, Natalie, you go for it.
If I can just jump in there, I'm just wondering whether with the recent upgrade to our software that sits behind Elemental being NAC, do you know if there's any adjustment to that size limit which is being accepted?
It's a good question, and one that I don't have an answer for, Natalie. Okay. You would think the size might increase, but it actually could have gone the other way. I'm not too sure. So the upgrade So we've just had a comment there, 30 megabyte, which is quite significant actually. So if you're talking just plain Word and Excel files, there's plenty there. But I guess when you're starting to get into bitmaps and JPEGs and large impact assessment reports, they obviously would probably go over 30 meg. So that's probably the issue, but those smaller reports should get through. So no, I don't think there's been any change with the new version, Natalie, but can't rule that out necessarily. But as I said to you all, there are ways around it. So Natalie and I are pretty personable duo, so feel free to email them through to us if that's easier to do as well. We also store, just as an aside, we also store all audit relevant supporting documentation in our secure oversight folders with respect to our oversight of every audit that's done too. So it is stored on file as well. Last call from anybody. We've done all right. We're at 42 minutes, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it was actually a 45 minutes on session. So we've done all right there actually. So last call, last drinks. I don't see any last questions. We've had about half a dozen. So that's been good, and some good feedback for us to consider too, even in the questions that were asked. So look, that probably looks like the last of our questions now that have been posted. So again, on the last slide, which I'm about to click onto, if it lets me, there we go. You'll see both my email address and Natalie's email address there on the slide too. So if you've got any further questions, or you're a little bit gun shy or had a bit of stage fright tonight and didn't want to provide a question, or you log off now and go, oh, I wish I'd asked that, by all means, send us both an email and we can get back to you anytime. So before I wrap up, it's just a personal thank you to everybody from Natalie and I with the challenges we've all faced over the last bit over 12 months with obviously what's been going on. So again, thanks for your ability to stay flexible and pragmatic through the process with the remote auditing and implementation of our COVID policy, keeping the certification process going. And without auditors, we don't have a certification process. So again, thank you to the auditors on the webinar tonight. Thank you to members on the call on the webinar today as well. And thank you all for attending. Enjoy the rest of your morning, day or evening, wherever you happen to be. So that's a thank you and a farewell from me and to Natalie.
Thanks, Cam. And I'll just echo that sentiment as well. Thank you all for joining us and enjoy the rest of your evening.